The heavy, grey downpour of a Portland November hammered against the aluminum roof of the loading dock, creating a deafening hum that made standard conversation impossible. I rechecked the tamper seals on the sterile extraction kits once, twice, then locked the serial numbers in waterproof ink before the moisture could smear the barcode labels. Inside those reinforced Pelican cases rested the digital calipers, the ground-penetrating radar interface, the environmental swabs, and the specific chain of custody ledger that decided whether our work held up or got torn apart in a hearing room. Budget got slashed again. Juliana's voice cut through the sound of the storm. I looked up from the tailgate of our department's reinforced SUV. Dr. Juliana Cooper, the chief medical examiner for the county, stood under the harsh fluorescent light of the overhang. She wore a dark, waterproof trench coat, her tablet illuminated against the gray Saturday afternoon. Her fingers swiped aggressively across the screen, her jaw tight with a stress she refused to verbalize. Kace managed to get the oversight committee to freeze our operational funds for this site visit, she continued. Her tone clipped as she kept her focus entirely on the spreadsheet. He cited administrative redundancies. We only have authorization for a single emergency shelter unit for the perimeter. I finished securing the padlock on the primary case with a sharp, metallic click. Kace Martin was the deputy examiner, a political opportunist who spent more time auditing our department's expenditures than analyzing case files. He wanted Juliana's job, and he was currently using a 10-year-old missing chain of custody document from a cold case to prove she was negligent. If we didn't drive 3 hours into the rural timberlands today to extract a parallel verification sample from the original burial site before Monday's 8 a.m. board meeting, her career was over. Juliana didn't blink at the freezing rain or the mud, she just stared at the notification on her screen, the words "missing signature," acting like a blade aimed straight at her department. She finally looked up from the tablet, a tired, sharp smile touching her face. It was a defense mechanism she used when cornered. "Why waste money on 2/10?" she asked, a dry challenge in her voice. "You're right," I agreed. She blinked, the tablet dropping slightly in her hands. She clearly expected me to argue or file a grievance with human resources regarding field protocols. "The structural integrity of the authorized four-season shelter is superior," I explained, pulling the heavy nylon straps over the cases and locking them into the cargo bed. "The thermal efficiency of shared cubic space reduces the need for secondary propane heaters, which preserves our remaining budget for the generator fuel required to power the mobile equipment. 1/10 satisfies the requirement perfectly." I watched her process the logic. I saw the micro adjustment of her grip on the tablet, the slight drop of her tense shoulders. "Right," she said, her voice dropping back to a grounded professional cadence. "Good. Drive time is roughly 3 hours. We need to be on site before the ground freezes solid. The GPS routing is locked, and I have the transit documents from the State Forestry Division," I told her. I closed the tailgate with a solid, echoing thud. I walked around the side of the vehicle, the freezing rain instantly coating my jacket. I opened the passenger door and waited. She did not hesitate. She climbed in, bringing the scent of cold air and bitter black coffee into the cabin. I shut the door, cutting off the sound of the storm, and walked to the driver's side. 90 minutes into the dense, oppressive greenery of the Oregon pine forests, the concrete highway transitioned into a treacherous gravel logging road. The heater blasted warm air against my boots, regulating the cabin temperature to a precise 68 degrees. "He sent the formal complaint to the state board last night," Juliana said, staring out the passenger window at the blur of wet timber. "Kace?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the slick winding path. "Yes," she replied. She opened her briefcase on her lap, pulling out a thick, tabbed binder. He documented 4 instances where the original chain of custody paperwork from the 2014 John Doe was supposedly mishandled during the facility transfer. I was the junior examiner on duty that night. Because the digital ledger was corrupted, he's arguing that the physical evidence was compromised. If I can't produce the parallel verification sample directly from the original site to confirm the markers by Monday at 8 a.m., the board will sustain his complaint. We will retrieve the sample, I stated, turning the steering wheel smoothly to avoid a washed-out rut. We will log the temperature, photograph the soil striations, apply the tamper-evident seals on site, and I will personally countersign the transfer document. We will eliminate his ambiguity. Juliana rubbed her left temple. We might not even get to the dirt. The local sheriff's office hates city personnel digging in their jurisdictions. 10 minutes later, her prediction materialized. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the gray sleet ahead. A county cruiser was parked horizontally across the narrow access road leading to the cemetery. I brought the SUV to a slow, controlled stop. A man in a heavy rain slicker stepped out of the cruiser, holding up a gloved hand. "Stay here," I told Juliana. I unbuckled my belt, grabbed a plastic folio from the center console, and stepped out into the freezing rain. I walked up to the officer. His name tag read, Alvarez. "Roads closed, city," Deputy Lane Alvarez said, his voice loud over the wind. "You folks don't have local clearance to disturb a closed site." I did not argue jurisdiction or threaten to call his supervisor. I opened the waterproof folio and handed him a single sheet of heavy stock paper. "Memorandum of Understanding, Deputy," I said, my voice carrying clearly without shouting. "Countersigned at 11 p.m. last night by the county circuit judge. It mandates immediate unimpeded access for state medical personnel." Alvarez squinted at the paper, rain running off the brim of his hat. He saw the judge's signature and the official county seal. He handed it back, his posture deflating slightly. He knew the difference between a precinct policy and a judge's direct order. "Make it quick," Alvarez muttered, turning back to his cruiser to move it out of the way. I returned to the SUV and put it in gear. Juliana was looking at me, her eyes tracking my movements as I steered us past the cruiser. "You bypassed the local precinct and went directly to the circuit judge?" she asked quietly. "Precincts debate policy, judges enforce law," I replied. "It saves time." By the time we reached the coordinates at 4:30 p.m., the rain had evolved into a steady, freezing sleet. The site was a clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs. A small, overgrown cemetery sat behind a rusted iron gate. The mud was deep and treacherous. I shifted the SUV into park and killed the engine. The silence of the forest immediately pressed in on us. "Grab the primary gear," Juliana ordered, her voice shifting back into the sharp authority of the chief. "I want the ground broken before nightfall." "Negative," I countered evenly, leaving my hands resting on the steering wheel. She paused, her hand on the door handle. She frowned. "Excuse me?" "The soil saturation level is too high," I explained, pulling up the meteorological data on the central console screen. I pointed to the red zones on the radar map. "If we break ground now, the rain will compromise the site integrity. The water will pool in the trench, immediately contaminating the sample with surface runoff. We establish the perimeter today. We set up the shelter. We extract tomorrow at 0600 when the temperature drops and the ground freezes enough to allow clean work." Juliana stared at the radar screen, her jaw tight. Her obsession with fixing the problem immediately fought against her logic. But she was a scientist, and the data was absolute. "Fine," she conceded, letting go of the door handle. We set up the camp. We worked in tandem. The cold bit through the layers of my insulated jacket as we unloaded the heavy Pelican cases, stacking them on a raised waterproof tarp. The heavy-duty geological survey tent went up next. I took the aluminum poles, snapping them into place with practiced efficiency. Juliana handled the heavy canvas, pulling it over the frame. We communicated entirely through the passing of stakes and the pulling of tension lines. Inside the 10 by 10 square, I unrolled the industrial thermal matting across the floor to block the damp cold rising from the earth. I set up the 2 folding cots on opposite sides of the space. Exactly 5 feet of empty air separated them. I placed a portable LED lantern in the dead center of the ceiling ridge, illuminating the space with a stark, bright white light. Juliana stood by her cot, peeling off her wet trench coat to reveal a standard-issue dark gray tactical sweater. The shadows under her eyes were prominent. "I'll assemble the mobile station," I told her, unlatching the first Pelican case. "I can do it," she said, stepping forward. "You need to review the historical file before we map the grid," I replied, handing her the heavy binder she had brought from the car. "I framed it as a division of labor, not a favor. I require your analysis on the exact depth of the original burial to calibrate the radar. I will handle the equipment." She took the binder, understanding the logistical block I had just placed in front of her to force her to sit down. "The original report stated 4 feet, not the standard 6, she murmured, sitting on the edge of her cot. I lined the vials by number, not by convenience, because one swapped label could end Juliana's career faster than any headline. I arranged the digital scales, the calibration weights, and the temperature logging beacons on the folding aluminum table. Every item had a designated quadrant. As I worked, I pulled a notebook from my chest pocket and a pen, mapping out a step-by-step plan for the next morning. 0530, wake and thermal check. 0600, establish secondary perimeter. 615, GPR scan. 0700, topsoil removal. I tore the sheet from the notebook, walked over to her cot, and placed the paper on the edge of her binder. She looked at the schedule, reading the rigid time blocks. "You're factoring in 2 hours for 3 feet of frozen topsoil?" "I am factoring in the density of the root system indicated by the tree line," I corrected gently. "It will take time, but it is accounted for." She let out a long, slow breath. The tension in her neck relaxed by a fraction of an inch. She looked at the meticulously arranged table, then back at me. "If you ever retire," she said, her voice dry, "don't. The department would fall apart." "I'll document that in my performance review," I replied evenly. At 1,900 hours, I prepared the field rations using a smokeless chemical heater. I handed her a foil pouch of heated stew and a plastic spoon. We ate in the quiet isolation of the forest. There were no sirens, no lab monitors beeping, no Kace Martin lingering by the water cooler. "He thinks I'm weak," Juliana said suddenly, staring at the metal poles of the tent ceiling. I paused, my spoon resting inside the foil pouch. "Kace does not evaluate strength, he evaluates leverage." "I signed off on the transfer log," she continued, her voice tight. "But the secondary courier lost the physical carbon copy and the digital backup corrupted. I should have verified the hard copy was filed. That's my failure. A failure of a clerical system from 6 years ago does not negate your expertise," I stated clearly. I set my food aside. "You are the chief, because you accurately determined the cause of death in the Miller case when 3 independent specialists missed the microscopic fractures. Kace is a bureaucrat. You are a scientist." She looked across the tent at me, the harsh light casting sharp shadows across her face. She pulled a stack of evidence tags from her pocket and began to pre-label them with a permanent marker. It was a repetitive, meticulous task, turning her anxiety into a physical ritual. I watched the steady movement of her hand for exactly 4 seconds, a quiet satisfaction settling in my chest that she was finding her center again, before I returned to my own ledger. The night passed in cold, rigid segments. I slept lightly, waking to check the perimeter sensors. At 0400, the temperature dropped below freezing. I heard Juliana shift on her cot, pulling the heavy sleeping bag tighter. She was shivering. I unzipped my own bag. I stood up, the freezing air biting through my base layers, and moved silently across the 5 feet of space. I reached for the secondary thermal blanket folded at the foot of her cot and pulled it up, draping it precisely over her shoulders to seal the draft. I did not touch her. She stopped shivering almost immediately, her breathing evening out into a deep rhythm. I walked back to my side of the tent and lay back down. Sunday morning broke with a pale, icy light. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest coated in a thin, brittle layer of frost. We were on site at 0600. The gravesite was marked by a sunken rectangular depression, I powered up the ground-penetrating radar cart, pushing it over the frozen grass in precise grid lines. The screen fed me real-time density metrics. Anomaly detected at 1.2 meters. I called out, marking the boundary with a neon flag. That's our target. Juliana stood by with a heavy mattock looking focused. Let's break it open. The physical labor was brutal. The topsoil was frozen solid. I took the primary swing, driving the steel blade into the earth with measured force to shatter the crust, establishing the trench walls. Juliana worked the secondary shovel, clearing the loose dirt. By 10:15, my spade struck something hollow. I dropped the heavy shovel and switched to the hand trowel and the bristle brush. Juliana knelt beside me in the mud. There, she pointed, her gloved finger hovering inches over a gray, soil-stained fragment. I used the brush to clear the dirt. It was the specific verification sample required to match the 2014 file. Measurements, I requested. Juliana pulled the calipers from her kit, leaning in. Width is 42 millimeters. Condition is highly degraded but structurally intact for extraction. I picked up the sterile swab, taking a soil sample to establish the environmental baseline. Using the sterilized tongs, I lifted the fragment directly into the heavy plastic evidence vial she held out. She sealed the cap. Time of extraction is 1,042 hours, I stated, logging the time and coordinates in my notebook. Suddenly, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the trees from the steep incline directly above the cemetery. The heavy rain from the previous day had saturated the slope, and the sudden freeze had caused the soil to expand. A massive, dead pine tree was tearing its root system out of the ground. Move, I commanded, grabbing the heavy nylon strap of Juliana's tactical vest. I hauled her backward, out of the trench, just as a localized mudslide let loose. A wall of dark earth, rocks, and splintered wood crashed down the slope, slamming into the iron fence and spilling heavily into the clearing. We stumbled back, slipping in the mud, landing hard against the side of our SUV. The roar of the slide lasted for 10 seconds before grinding to a halt. The silence that followed was heavy. My heart rate elevated to 110 beats per minute. I looked at the excavation site. The trench we had just spent 4 hours digging was completely buried under 3 feet of debris. Juliana was pinned between my arm and the door of the SUV. My forearm was braced against the metal, shielding her from any secondary debris. I could hear her rapid breathing. I could see the mud splattered across her cheek. "Are you injured?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely flat, checking her pupils for shock. "No," she gasped out, her hands gripping the front of my jacket. She looked over my shoulder at the buried trench. "The vial." I lifted my left hand. My gloved fingers were clamped tightly around the sealed plastic cylinder. Juliana stared at the vial, then let out a shaky exhale, her forehead dropping against my shoulder for exactly 2 seconds. It was a momentary collapse of her rigid architecture, a silent admission of trust. "You held on to it," she whispered. "I do not lose evidence," I replied. I stepped back deliberately, giving her space to regain her composure. I opened the SUV door. "Get inside. I will secure the equipment." It took me 40 minutes to dig the radar cart out of the edge of the slide. When I climbed into the driver's seat, the cabin was warm. Juliana was staring straight ahead, holding the vial securely. Before I could shift into gear, the satellite phone mounted on the dashboard lit up. The caller ID displayed the Portland Precinct Dispatch. I pressed the speaker button. "Myers." "Nathanael, it's Kian." The voice of our lab technician came through, static heavily distorting the audio. "I need Dr. Cooper." "I'm here, Kian," Juliana said, leaning closer. "What is it?" "It's Kace," Kian said, his voice tense. "He filed an emergency injunction with the board. He claims you took unauthorized department resources off-site without logging a specific case number. The board moved the audit hearing. It's not just a review anymore. It's tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. If you aren't standing in that room with verified sequence results, they are voting to terminate your contract." Juliana froze. The color drained from her face. "Understood." "Log the call," I said, cutting the connection. Juliana stared at the dark screen. Tomorrow morning. He knows we can't process the sample and run the verification sequence by 0800. It takes 24 hours in the centrifuge. We don't have the time. Her breathing hitched. The career she had built was being dismantled by an impossible deadline. I pulled my notebook from my pocket. I flipped to a blank page. "We do not need the centrifuge," I stated, my pen clicking sharply. She turned to me, her eyes wide. "What?" "The board requires verifiable proof that this sample belongs to the 2014 John Doe. The original 2014 autopsy file explicitly listed the surgical implant manufacturer and the lot number used to repair a fracture on his leg," I explained. "We do not need to wait for a biological sequence. We need the hardware." Juliana stared at me, the realization clicking into place. "We need to clean the fragment, expose the surgical plate, and read the serial numbers under the macro lens," I continued, writing the steps down. "I have the manufacturer's registry downloaded on my encrypted drive." We cross-referenced the serial number to the 2014 surgical lot. "That is irrefutable parallel evidence." Her mouth opened slightly. "Can we do that here? In the tent?" "I packed the ultrasonic cleaner and the macro photography rig," I confirmed. "We set up the field lab. We execute the verification. We drive back tonight. We walk into the boardroom at 0800. I watched the panic recede from her eyes, replaced by the brilliant focus of the scientist I respected. She didn't need a savior. She needed a logistical pathway. "Let's get to work," she said. Inside the tent, the environment became a hyper-focused laboratory. I set up the ultrasonic cleaner, filling the basin with sterile water and enzymatic solvent. I calibrated the frequency. Juliana carefully unsealed the vial, transferring the sample into the steel basket. I turned the machine on. The high-frequency hum vibrated through the metal table. For the next 3 hours, we operated in absolute synchronicity. As the solvent stripped away 10 years of degraded earth, the dull gray of the sample gave way to the sharp glint of surgical titanium. At 1,800 hours, I transferred the fragment to the sterile mat under the macro lens camera. I connected the feed to my field laptop. Juliana leaned over my shoulder. I kept my posture rigid, ignoring the warmth of her proximity, focusing entirely on the high-definition image rendering on the screen. I adjusted the focal length, zooming in on the head of the second helical screw. The numbers came into sharp relief. TX884902. I opened the encrypted database file, typed the sequence, and hit enter. A green match window populated the screen. Lot status: verified. Dispatched to Portland General Trauma Center, November 2013. Patient ID correlation: John Doe, 2014-04. "We have it," Juliana whispered, her voice thick with relief. I initiated the secure printing sequence. The small, portable thermal printer clicked to life, spooling out a hard copy of the high-definition photograph and the database match. I signed my name across the bottom edge, officially validating the chain of custody, and handed the pen to her. She signed her name next to mine. "The parallel evidence is secured," I stated. "We depart for the city in 30 minutes. We drove through the night, navigating the treacherous roads by the high beams of the SUV. Juliana fell asleep in the passenger seat exactly 1 hour into the drive. I kept my eyes on the road. I did not turn on the radio. I drove with mechanical precision, ensuring our safe arrival. I had protected her work. The rest was up to her. We reached the Portland Medical Examiner's building at 7:15 a.m. on Monday morning. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray. We walked through the glass doors of the lobby side by side, our boots tracking dried mud onto the polished linoleum. At exactly 7:58 a.m., I pushed the heavy oak doors of the third-floor boardroom open. The oversight committee sat around the long mahogany table. Kace Martin stood at the head of the room, a laser pointer in his hand, a PowerPoint slide titled Procedural Negligence projected behind him. He stopped mid-sentence. "Dr. Cooper," Kace said, recovering quickly with a patronizing smile. "We weren't sure you were going to make it, given the unauthorized absence. Juliana did not flinch. She walked straight to the head of the table. She possessed a commanding, absolute authority that no tailored suit could replicate. She pulled the heavy manila envelope from her briefcase and dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table with a loud, satisfying slap. Inside that envelope is the verified, macro-photographic evidence of the surgical hardware from the 2014 John Doe, cross-referenced with the manufacturer's registry, Juliana stated, her voice ringing clear across the silent room. Kace stared at the envelope. His smile vanished. "You can't verify that without a sequence. That takes 24 hours. The original autopsy file listed the implant manufacturer and lot number hardware that can be traced without waiting for a lab sequence," she replied effortlessly. "The serial numbers are irrefutable. Furthermore, the envelope contains a sworn affidavit, countersigned by Dr. Myers, confirming the chain of custody from the extraction site to this room." She turned slightly, looking back at me. Dr. Myers managed the extraction logistics, secured the perimeter during a hazardous terrain collapse, and executed the on-site forensic verification. The protocol was flawless. The head of the committee, a stern older woman, opened the envelope. She reviewed the signed printout, then looked up at Kace. "Mr. Martin," the chairwoman said, her tone lethal. "It appears the evidence is intact. Your claim of negligence is dismissed. I suggest you spend less time auditing your superiors." Kace's jaw clenched. He closed his laptop sharply and walked out of the room without a word. Juliana looked at the board members. "If you'll excuse us, we have a backlog to clear." We walked out of the boardroom and down the quiet hallway toward her office. The adrenaline was fading. As we approached her door, Kian stepped out of the adjacent lab, holding a clipboard. "Locker 4 is secured, Chief," Kian said, handing her a yellow carbon slip. "Here's the intake receipt for the physical fragment." "Thank you, Kian. File the duplicate," Juliana instructed. Kian nodded and walked back into the lab. Juliana turned to me. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the exhaustion on her face, but her eyes were bright. "You gave me the strategy," she said quietly. "You didn't just fix the problem. You gave me the weapon to fight him." "You are the chief," I replied. "You only needed the data to prove it." She looked down at the intake receipt, then back up at me. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her electronic keycard for the primary lab, the master access badge that only she carried. She stepped forward, closing the professional distance between us. With precise, deliberate movements, she reached up and physically clipped the master badge onto the front pocket of my tactical jacket, right where anyone walking past could see it. She stepped back immediately, giving me space. "I need a deputy who understands structure," she said, her voice steady. "I'm promoting you, Nathanael. Effective immediately." I looked down at the badge resting against my chest, understanding the weight of the public claim she had just made. "You can say no," she added quietly, ensuring the boundary was clear. "The promotion stands either way. But you're not just my deputy, you're my person." I looked at her, recognizing the offer she was making without demanding a surrender of my independence. "I accept," I said. I pulled my notebook from my pocket, uncapped my pen, and began to draft our new schedule. Monday nights became our standing check-in cases, coffee, and a clean ledger. I learned that true safety isn't found in grand, dramatic gestures. It is built through consistency, clear boundaries, and the quiet competence of showing up when it matters. Real love isn't about chaos. It's about holding the line. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.